Get out of the way.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is good to have you all here. It is a beautiful day, and the sky is that Carolina blue color. As many of you know, thank you. My years in Durham made me a Duke fan, and I am in grieving right now. But I thank you, John Bailey. I appreciate that. But I realized that Dr. Echerd, BA, graduate and PhD at that school of that light color blue. And I'm going to call that a win for me. So, and also a win for you for having him here on this beautiful day in spring break time. So, Art, thank you very much.
Okay. Yes, I wasn't going to mention anything about UNC winning, but since you brought that up, that's right. If my wife was here, she would. She's more fanatical than I am about. But I hope most of y'all were here last Sunday. I know some of you weren't. We even thought about maybe not doing a class this Sunday because I knew a lot of people would be gone. But then we thought we'll just go ahead and do the continuity, particularly since people can zoom in and so on. But let me start. Actually, I'll start with Jeb Bush. If y'all remember last time I said that there were Presbyterians in the middle of the 19th century that were sort of proto-Zionists. They were like forerunners of what we now call Christian Zionism. And the two most prominent ones were both Presbyterians. One was actually from Scotland that I talked about last time. And I think if most of y'all have this list, did they kind of get around one way or the other? I never know whether I would leave them in the seats and all, but I got down basically, which is typical of me, not even through the first page, but got down to about 2/3 of the way down, but where it says Christian Zionists, and it has these two names, Alexander Keith, who is this gentleman, and then a man whose name actually was George Bush, and he was from New England. I don't know if there's any relation, probably is related to the other Bushes, but both of them wrote works in the 1840s saying that the Jewish people should have a homeland. It needs to be in Palestine again. And just to review what I talked about last time, mainly I talked about ancient history, medieval history. I did have to go back to, it was like the call of Abraham to talk about the contemporary issue. But I hope that all that made sense. I do realize that one thing I didn't talk about last time that's pretty important when I was talking about the sacredness of Jerusalem, and that it's the holiest city in the world, obviously to Jews and to Christians generally, but the third holiest city to Muslims. And I talked a bit about that, about the Temple Mount and so on. But I should have mentioned, because it's going to come up again, right about the middle of your list, a little bit above the middle, but it says Al-Quds, which means the holy, or it can be the Holy Land in Arabic. And that's what Muslims generally call Jerusalem. And some of you might be thinking, I've heard the word Quds before, Quds. Does anyone know why that's a sort of a contemporary issue? There's an organization called the Quds Force. Yes, for what country? Yeah. Well, there are people who want to liberate, but the Iranian government has an organization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, and there's a branch of it called the Quds Force. And they are particularly devoted to some of the actions we certainly consider terrorism. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump was asked about it. And he thought they were talking about the Kurds. And he said, oh, yes, the Kurds are wonderful people. And he said, no, it's the Quds Force, which he clearly did not know what that was. And so he kind of gave this kind of vague answer and moved on. But it is, Iran, of course, is the most fervent supporter of the Palestinian cause in the Middle East. And Iran's not an Arab country, and a lot of Palestinians give them credit for that. But they have this branch of their military that's dedicated particularly to that and to liberating Al-Quds. And I had a friend who's lived in Israel who speaks Arabic and so on, and he feels like that most of the Arab nations really don't care about the Palestinians, but they do care about the Holy Land. They do care about liberating Jerusalem from Zionists, he said. But I just wanted you to know what that refers to. But this question about Christian Zionists, they generally wanted the Jews to be able to return partly out of just a sympathy, but also to hasten the second coming of Jesus. And today, as you know, there are lots of Protestant, particularly evangelical Protestants in America who are really more vehemently pro-Zionist than the average Jewish person in the United States. So this is something sort of long-standing. And as I said last time, it was actually Alexander Keith, a Scottish Presbyterian, who had this line that so often you hear, and people think it's from a Jewish Zionist, but the line that there is a land without a people for a people without a land. You know, we need to bring them together. But obviously, people usually cite that now to say it's based on a mistaken assumption that obviously Palestine was never just empty. But I now want to talk about Zionism, finally, which obviously is a movement that leads to the creation of Israel. And Mount Zion, I'll show you a picture of it. What some people think is Zionism is even controversial about where Mount Zion is. There's more than one elevated spot in Jerusalem that people think was the original Mount Zion. But Zion eventually, of course, came to mean Jerusalem itself. It came to mean even just, you know, the Holy Land from a Jewish perspective. In fact, when the modern state of Israel was created in 1948, they debated right up almost to the very moment about what they would call this country. And some people wanted to call it Zion. Some people wanted to call it Eretz Israel, which means the land of Israel, but they decided on just Israel. But in terms of the creation of Zionism, most people think of it as having started with Theodor Herzl, who was generally thought of as the father of Israel. But that term was coined by someone else, as we'll see in a minute. And there were certainly people who believed in what becomes known as Zionism before Herzl. And there are probably at least like 10 different versions of Zionism. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I told y'all last time there's a joke among Jewish people about how they tend to be divisive and argue about a lot of points and all, which I think is a sign of just intellectual activity. But the joke is that if you get 3 Jewish people together, you'll have 4 different opinions. Well, you know, and like I said, that was also said about the ancient Athenians, sort of for the same reason. But I think the history of Zionism kind of bears that out. And I was trying to keep all the different strands straight. Different types of Zionism, though, at times overlap. They are not all mutually exclusive, but I'm going to talk about a few of them. I don't have the name of this man on your list, but I will tell you his name. Very interesting name. It's Abraham Isaac Kook, spelled K-O-O-K. And of course, for some people think that he actually was, but his followers are not. He was a rabbi from Latvia who lived from 1865 to 1935. He eventually immigrated to Palestine in 1904. But he's a good example of what people call religious Zionism. In some ways, I'm hesitant to start with that because I usually have to disabuse people of the notion that the creation of Israel was largely about the practice of Judaism. Because for the most part, the Zionist movement was very secular. And religious Zionism was really, in some ways, the exception. And I'll talk more about that later. Certainly, Theodor Herzl, as the father of Israel, was not an observant Jew, at least not after his childhood. He didn't even bar mitzvah his son. He didn't know Yiddish or Hebrew. But I'll talk more about that later. But this man certainly was religious. But he was the exception in that he was certainly, like I said, he was an Orthodox rabbi. But he did believe that eventually this movement of Zionism, which was mainly done by really non-observant Jews, but he felt like they were sort of unintentionally playing a role in hastening the coming of the Messiah. He said the Jews do need to come back to Palestine. We shouldn't wait until the Messiah appears, which is what most Orthodox Jews believed right down until just a few decades ago. So like I said, he was the exception. But he felt that there were things that Jews could go ahead and do, and although the secular Zionists were not really thinking in terms of a traditional Messiah, he didn't care. Like I said, he thought they were unintentionally contributing to the advent of Messiah. So there has been a type of sort of religious Zionism from the very start, but really it's not until, I would say, the 1970s that most observant Orthodox Jews began to embrace Zionism. But when they did, they embraced it, zealously. Some of you would say fanatically. And the Orthodox Jewish world now is really split because there are still plenty of them, including some who live in Jerusalem, but who won't even touch Israeli money because they say it's part of a sort of a blasphemous scheme to create a kind of, substitute surrogate Israel, and the Messiah has not shown up yet. And so there are still Orthodox Jews who feel that way. But many of them have finally decided, kind of like Kook did back in the early 20th century, that maybe these secular Zionists are just part of a larger plan by God. And today, I think a lot of you know, the most hardline Zionists tend to be religious. The ones who settle, essentially illegally in the occupied territories in the West Bank tend to be these Orthodox, strongly, fervently Zionist Jews. But before I forget, I want to make the point that usually surprises people in the United States, that there's only been one Israeli prime minister since the creation of Israel in 1948 who has been, or he's still alive, who was an observant Jew. And he's the one you probably don't even remember because he was only prime minister for less than a year, around 21 to 2022. But do y'all remember Naphtali Bennett? Was his name? No, it doesn't ring a bell. Okay. Well, he was briefly in power of the coalition. Netanyahu had been in power for years. Bennett lasted for about not even a year. And then Netanyahu, as you all know, is back in. But I wish that guy had never become prime minister, because then I could just say categorically, no prime minister of Israel, period, has been an observant Jew, including people you think of as like super Jewish, like Netanyahu or Menachem Begin, or Yitzhak Rabin. None of those people, or Yitzhak Shamir rather, the hardliners, the people in the Likud, they generally aren't observant Jews either. They are not people who go to synagogue and so on, but they obviously very much consider themselves Jewish. And so obviously with my students, I always have to first start off by saying, what do you think a Jewish person, what is a Jew? And they normally will say, someone who practices the religion of Judaism. And I have to immediately say, well, no. And I give them that example. So it's much more complicated than that. I wish it was that simple. The majority of people in the United States now who identify as being Jewish also say, I'm not an observant Jew, but I'm very much a Jew. So, cultural thing. Obviously, when the Nazis and people like them came along, there was this idea that it was a biological reality to being Jewish, which, we reject. But it is extremely complicated. Yes. That they feel like there is a Jewish people based on a culture, shared culture, and history. And obviously it does have religious roots eventually. I mean, when you say that Karl Marx was a Jew, as an adult, he was a militant atheist. As a boy, he was actually baptized as a Christian because his father converted, mainly to rise. He couldn't practice law in Germany back then unless he was a Christian, so he became a Protestant Christian. But for people to call Karl Marx a Jew is mainly based on the fact that his ancestors were practicing Jews. In fact, he had a lot of rabbis in his family tree. But yeah, it's extremely complicated. I mean, the political Zionists, the ones like Theodor Herzl, essentially felt like Jews were a nationality, just like Hungarians or Poles or Czechs. And that, in the late 19th century, the forces of nationalism were stronger than they probably had ever been. They were stronger than they ever been. And there were Jews like Herzl and others who started feeling like we need to have a nation state too. And what they wanted to do, which is interesting to me, is the ones like Herzl was for Jewish nationalism to become less exceptional, because obviously every nationality is unique, but Jewish nationalism was uniquely unique because they didn't have any kind of homeland. Even Hungarians and Poles, they didn't have their own nation state at that point, but there was an area in the world where they were the majority, but Jews were not. And so the Zionist movement is about trying to get rid of that uniqueness, of saying we're tired of being always a stranger in a strange land, the people without really a country, the wandering Jew. But as someone pointed out, the irony is the Zionists were trying to become like a normal nationality in the most abnormal part of the entire world, which is the Holy Land. And so that's partly why this has been such a controversial issue. But by the way, I'm glad you asked that, because raise your hand, whatever. If you have questions, I'll just keep going on, but I would love to hear from y'all if you have anything to contribute or object to or a question. I'll try to say, oh, that also reminds me, someone needs to tell me when, there's maybe 10 minutes left. So I'll stop and have time for questions. So someone just start waving, like this, like television, because my students will tell you he'll go on forever if you don't stop him, but moving on with another type of very interesting Zionism, which is often called cultural Zionism. Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's on your list, but he's also up there on the screen, I hope, yes. Very impressive gentleman. He is the man, as it says on the book title, the father of modern Hebrew. He immigrated when he was in his late 20s to Palestine in the 1880s, I guess, or 1881. And he thought the most important thing of all was to revive the Hebrew language, because if you think about what is a nationality in Europe, so often, not always, but nationality is usually based on a shared language. But that's not always the case, because there is, I think, a Swiss type of nationality, and they have 4 different languages. But most of you know, I think probably all of you know, that Hebrew had ceased to be a vernacular, a spoken native language, even before the time of Jesus. He spoke not Hebrew, but what? Yes, which is related, it's a Semitic language too. But he spoke Aramaic because when the Persian Empire ruled almost all that part of the world, they themselves were speaking Persian, they still do, which was an Indo-European language, so it's related to English, actually. But most of the people they ruled over to the west of them were Semitic of some point, in some way. So they adopted Aramaic as like a lingua franca. So Jesus spoke Aramaic. So to revive Hebrew, it was literally going back over 2,000 years. And most people thought this was crazy. In fact, again, Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Israel, he talked with Eliezer ben Yehuda at one point, and he said, "You're going to try to revive this dead language?" He said, "That's ridiculous." But they did. It is one of the amazing stories. Like I said, the creation of modern Israel is probably the most improbable story of the 20th century. However you feel about it, where you feel like it was a mistake or a travesty or a miraculous thing, but it certainly is the most improbable thing. Theodor Herzl was called the Jewish Jules Verne during his lifetime, which you all know. He was a great science fiction writer. But Eliezer ben Yehuda, who I wanted to put up a picture, but I don't have one, of a statue of him that's in the place where he was born, which is Belarus. And the people in Belarus today actually kind of celebrate him as a homie, someone who had this huge impact. And the statue of him makes him look extremely fierce, but he had to obviously go to the biblical Hebrew and then start adding thousands of words. And they've done that ever since. Let me get the statistics about this. Yeah, the Old Testament only had what Christians call the Old Testament, only has 7,704 words in it. So he eventually was able to create a vernacular that had about 50,000 words. And obviously they're adding to it all the time. But he was a little bit of a nutcase about this, I think, at least that's his son. And he was determined for his son to be the first person to be a native Hebrew speaker for over 2,000 years. And so when he and his wife raised him, they wouldn't let him hear anyone speaking anything other than Hebrew. So it became his first language. And at one point, apparently, Eliezer got mad at his wife because she started singing a lullaby to him, which was in Russian. He said, no, you can't let him hear any Russian. He didn't hardly have any little friends because they wouldn't let him play with little kids. Obviously, none of them spoke Hebrew. But it takes that kind of obsessive nut, really, I think, to change the world sometimes. And his father was that way. Itamar was his name. But so you have, and of course, the idea was if we're going to have an Israel, it's going to be settled by people from all over the world. And so what language can we use? And he felt it was fair to say, we're all going to learn a new language, but it's our original language, our old language. And they were able to do that. So now, Hebrew is, once again, a modern vernacular. Most people in Israel also speak English, you probably know, but Hebrew is their tongue. So that's more of cultural Zionism. I want to move on, though, to also what's called labor Zionism. Some of you know that, of the isms that were so strong in Europe at the end of the 19th century, nationalism was the single most important one, I would say. That certainly helps create Zionism. But socialism was very strong for us. And Moses Hess was an early follower of Karl Marx. That's a picture of Hess. He believed that if we create an Israel, it needs to be a type of sort of socialist utopia, socialist paradise. He eventually moved away a bit. I'm going to make sure I get this right. He was born in Bonn, Yeah, the one problem about trying to get all the Zionists straight is, of course, they're born in various places, mainly born in what was then the Russian Empire. And so, just to kind of warn you, when you hear that someone was a Russian Jew, or if a Jewish person in the United States today says, "Oh, yes, my parents or my great-great-grandparents immigrated from Russia," they usually weren't living in what's now Russia. They were living in what's now Ukraine or Belarus or Poland or Lithuania, because all those were inside the Russian Empire, at least most of Poland was. And very few American Jews are descended from people who came from what's now Russia. But he was actually born in Bonn, in Germany. Um, his father was a rabbi, but eventually he got up with the two fathers of communism, one of whom was, like I said, culturally Jewish, who I think is the next picture there. Yes, Brother Karl there, Karl Marx, and then Friedrich Engels. Um, but Hess started thinking that nationalism was more important than Engels or Marx did. Engels and Marx both believed that all these other types of identity, like tribalism, linguistic, ethnic, religious identities, were fading because of capitalism, and they were all going to disappear, basically, and that all would matter would be your class. But Hess, who again wrote this book, just thought he was wrong about that, and clearly Marx was wrong in terms of ethnic identity sort of vanishing because of capitalism. Um, but he called for a Jewish socialist commonwealth in Palestine. Um, it's interesting, he's living in a time when you finally got the creation of an Italy for the first time in history in 1870, the creation of a Germany for the first time in 1871. But Moses Hess was, who, spoke German himself, like I said, born in Bonn. But he was prophetic about one thing. He said, I don't think German nationalism is going to be very tolerant of other types of nationalism. And sadly, of course, he was all too correct. I mean, no one could have predicted exactly what German nationalism would lead to. Um, but so he's, in some ways, like I said, back to Hess's picture, a founder of what becomes known as labor Zionism. And some of you know that the political party that ran Israel for the first almost 30 years of existence, from 1948 to 1977, is the Labor Party. It was the party of Golda Meir, the party of David Ben-Gurion, and so on. It was a kind of a moderately left-wing socialist party in Israel. But and the other thing about combining elements of socialism with Zionism, is anyone thinking of something that Israel's famous for in terms of particularly agricultural production? Yeah, the kibbutz ideal, the idea of having a kind of communal collective existence. Again, I want to make sure I get this the way I want to talk about it. You have two different types, and I'm not sure I have pictures right here of them or not. No, I think I have to get to them a little bit later. You're going to find out why I have George Burns there in just a second. So when I recognize him, it's like, we'll go to here. But yeah, this is where I want to make sure I get the date straight. Kibbutz is a type of Zionist commune, very strict commune, where you eat collectively in a mess hall. You have family units, but for the most part, the children are kind of raised collectively. You certainly farm the land collectively and sell it and so on. It's very much a type of socialist experiment. Kibbutz means gathering in Hebrew. The first one was in 1909. There's now about 270 of them. And the great majority of Israelis have never lived in a kibbutz, but they tend to produce disproportionately large number of the pioneers of Zionism and the leaders of Zionism and generals of Israel, I should say, I guess. They produce about 9% of Israel's industrial output, but they produce about 40% of its agricultural output. And the people in the kibbutz, and of course, when Hamas attacked back in October, they attacked some of these kibbutzim that were near Gaza. But they often feel like that we're the real Zionists because they were the ones who were sort of the pioneers in a lot of ways. And there was a Zionist who said, when the Jew has the plow in his hand in Palestine, then the Jewish question will be solved. In other words, a lot of Jews in Eastern Europe felt like one reason we need to have our own country is we don't have certain segments of society where Jews do certain things. Like, Jews generally were not in the military in these countries where they were a minority. They often were not allowed to own land. They were not even allowed often to be artisans and join guilds. And so they often end up being mainly, people involved in mercantile activity, retail. and money lending and things like that. And the Zionists felt like that was very unhealthy. We need to be everything. We need to be the warriors. We need to be the farmers. We need to be the scholar, So that's, part of this sort of the kibbutz ideal. Now, a more popular form of collective farming that's a little less radical, but it has a lot more people in it, is called a moshav, which might be on there. Yeah, it's on there, which means settlement. That ideal starts in 1921. And like I said, there's about 270 kibbutzim, but there are 448 moshavim now. They have farms of equal size, but individual families own them. But then they're like a farmer's co-op. They purchase things, together. They market their produce together, but there's more of a sense that you have your own land and your own family and so on. There's also a very important labor organization to start in Israel in 1920 that kind of creates the Labor Party. Now, the Labor Party is still there, but they've been out of power for the most part since 1977. That's when the Likud started coming to power with Menachem Begin and later people like Ariel Sharon and then Netanyahu. But the first leader, in some ways, the George Washington, you might say, of Israel was David Ben-Gurion, and he was definitely a member of the Labor Party. And speaking of not being observant Jews, how many of you recognize the name David Ben-Gurion? Just because, like, the big airport in Israel, International Airport, it's named after him, which tells you something, of course. He immigrated as a young man to Palestine, changed his name to Son of a Lion, Ben-Gurion, but he was very interested in the Hebrew scriptures as a sort of source of history about the Jews, but his religious inclination was almost completely towards Hinduism and Buddhism, was what he was actually fascinated by. And there's a famous photo of him doing yoga. I'll show it to you eventually, where he's standing on his head on the beach. But moving on, the next person. Oh, well, I guess I should say one last thing about the labor Zionism. There was a very important socialist organization, basically Marxist organization, that was founded in the Russian Empire in 1897, and it was called the Bund, which means like the League in German, or the Jewish Bund. Its full name was the General Union of the Jewish Workers of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. But it's very important because they split eventually into the people who decided they wanted to also take a Zionist path, and then the ones who said, no, that's completely antithetical to Marxism, and they, eventually joined up with the Marxists. But that Bund is 1 year older than the party that turned into the Bolsheviks and turned into the communists that took over in Russia. They were founded in 1898. And I guess I should say this because it's so important in terms of the story of anti-Semitism, which I talked about years ago here. I feel like I should do that again in connection with all this. But all of you know that one of the slanders or libels against Jews is that they invented communism as a way to enslave, Gentiles. And that's certainly what the Nazis said. But a lot of people say that. And obviously, Jewish people did play a disproportionate role. Karl Marx was a Jew, quote unquote. Leon Trotsky, the second most important Bolshevik, was a Jew. A lot of the early Bolsheviks were. And there are reasons why they tended to play a large role in socialist movements. And so, the Bund is an example of that. But this gentleman, I want to get my notes here before we move on with him, is, I think, on your list. Yes, he's near the bottom. Peretz Smolinskin, born in 1842, died in 1885. He was from a town called Smolensk, where his name comes from. He was brought up an Orthodox Jew in the Russian Empire. He also wanted to turn Hebrew into a genuinely modern vernacular, but he founded a periodical in 1868 called The Dawn that promoted this idea of a cultural, Zionism in a sense. So like I said, it's, these things sort of overlap. But he and two other Jewish students in Vienna formed a Jewish fraternity. And eventually this organization turned into what they called the Kadima, which means forward. Later as a party in Israel that for a while had that name. But he certainly leaned towards, the Jews being not just a religious group, but a national group as well. And one of his followers is the person, like I need to keep moving on. Well, this is not his father. This is actually someone who worked with him. This is another Scottish guy. He was actually born in South Africa, But this is Lawrence Oliphant, whose name is right underneath it. He's another example of, a Gentile from Britain who fervently believed the Jews should have their own homeland. And he has a really interesting history. He was involved in various types of sort of utopian Christian communities, including one in New York State for a while. But he was certainly a visionary. But the reason I think he needs to be remembered, for a while, Jews in Eastern Europe just adored him. They called him the new Cyrus, which, if you know, that means referring to Cyrus, the Persian emperor, who let Jews go back, out of their captivity back in like 500 BCE. They said that often Jewish homes had pictures of Oliphant along with a couple other Jewish Zionist leaders, but he definitely believed that the British Empire should be involved in helping the Jews. And at first he thought of it mainly as a way to help the British Empire. He said, we need to let Jews come back and settle in particularly the northern half of Palestine, north of Jerusalem, which is a more fertile part. Partly to help check the spread of Russian influence, because in the late 19th century, the Russian Empire was pushing into to the Mediterranean world, and the British. That's why the Crimean War was fought in the 1850s. Was Britain and France worrying about sort of expansion of Russian power and so on. So at first he was thinking of it mainly in terms of helping British imperial interests, but then he started, I think, genuinely, sincerely feeling like it's even more important that Jews have their own country, and he eventually ends up living in Palestine. He dies there. He's buried there. But he corresponded with Smolensk, and I'm not sure they ever actually met. But it's again, this modern Israel was created partly out of imperialism, which is, of course, one reason why so many people now are so against it. But it is connected with the story of late European imperialism. That's simply a fact. But this is his secretary, whose name I think is on there. Yes, Naphtali Hertz Imber. He was an important Zionist, and above all, he's the man who wrote the song that's now the national anthem of Israel, the Hatikvah, which means the hope. And how many of you have seen the movie Exodus with Paul Newman and right, Peter Lawford? It's obviously extremely pro-Zionist version of all this stuff, but people talk about, particularly like most of us in this room are kind of my generation, I guess, are close to it, that often that's the way we view the story of the creation of Israel. 19 was through the eyes, the beautiful eyes of Paul Newman. But it has that song in it about midway through the movie when the Jews are trying to sneak into Palestine because the British government is trying to keep Jewish immigration down, and they're jumping off the ship and they're wading ashore. I don't know if y'all remember this movie now, but the melody, I think you would recognize. It's actually a Romanian folk melody, but then he wrote words for it. But it's, excuse me for this, but it's like da 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 da. Okay, I'll stop now. But that's it's one of the great national anthems. Again, whatever you think about Israel, but the Soviet anthem is another great one. But this is the hill that most people think was the original Mount Zion. And the person who coined that term is the man that I think is on your list next. Let's see, we got to flip over to the next page. Yeah. Nathan Birnbaum was one of Smolensky's followers, and that's him. He coined the term Zionism in 1890 from that hill. So, if you're wondering where that word originally come from, his original name, though, was, well, actually, the original name of George Burns is Nathan Birnbaum. It's just a coincidence, but I ran across it. I thought, okay, I got to put him up there, with his cigar and everything. When I was a little kid in North Carolina, which, when I was a kid, had virtually no Jewish people in it, really, or had no Catholics either, for that matter. But I didn't know that all these stand-up comedians back when I was a kid in the 60s, the overwhelming majority of them were Jewish, but almost none of them had, Jewish names. They had, stage names, which is sad that they felt like, they had, and sort of George Burns, that's a Scottish name, but Nathan Birnbaum was his real name. But moving on, Leon Pinsker is the next name on your list. Like I said, I'm trying to move this as fast as I can. He, But one thing about Birnbaum, he coins that term, but eventually he began to believe that Zionism wouldn't work out. And he increasingly turned towards Orthodox practicing Judaism instead. So it shows you the ambivalence that a lot of how complicated this whole story is. And when Herzl finally comes along and becomes the leading proponent of Zionism, uh, and let's see, I might have his, there he is. He died at 44, which to me now seems really young. It used not to, but Herzl was opposed by, you might say, both the left and the right, in a sense, among the Jewish community. I mean, assimilated Jews, which is what he was originally. Jews who were saying, okay, Europeans seem to be accepting us now, at least Western Europe and America, we seem to be getting accepted. And we want to become more like, we want to view ourselves as being German first and Jewish second, or French first and Jewish second, so on. So they did not want to see Zionism appear because they said, it kind of makes it look like we're being fools for thinking we can, be assimilated in these countries as a minority. But they also were very concerned about something which has certainly happened, which is that if you create an Israel, then every Jew in the world is going to be tainted with that creation, and people will view us as having divided loyalties. That they'll say that our real loyalty is to Israel, not, to our own country. And of course, that's exactly what has happened among a lot of people. You see it every day. So Herzl, who himself, we'll see, was very much from kind of an assimilated, kind of non-practicing Jewish background. They disagree with him on that. But also, as I said, the Orthodox, practicing Jews tended to say that this guy was not just wrong, that he was like a heretic, he was being sacrilegious because he was corrupting the idea of what Israel is supposed to be, because to them, to the Orthodox, Israel cannot be recreated until the Messiah shows up. And so for this man to say we can do it on our own as a bunch of sort of secularized European Jews, that, to them was horrible. And to some Orthodox Jews, it still is. Maybe I should say a little bit about Pinsker. He wrote this work that's on the list, Auto-Emancipation, which obviously means, emancipating yourself. And he did feel like that we can't be a fully authentic people until we have our own nation state. And by the way, people didn't tend to say that it had to be in Palestine. That's where it eventually ended up being. Most Zionists, I think, always kind of felt that's what it would be. But how many of you know that for a while, briefly, Herzl himself briefly considered an offer by the British to have what's called the Uganda Project, the Uganda Plan, I guess is better. Does anyone know about that? It actually was land that was in now what we would call Western Kenya, not Uganda, but that whole part of sort of British East Africa. Now that, of course, would produce a whole different set of problems if you created Israel in the heart of East Africa. But Cyprus was considered for a while. I mean, Herzl even brought that up. Can we maybe have the Jewish homeland in Cyprus? But the British said, no, we want to keep Cyprus, which they had until 1960. So you might know there was a serious effort, and there were plenty of people who went and settled in Argentina. So there wasn't a consensus, a unanimous consensus that had to be in Palestine. Sigmund Freud, who was another one of these sort of secularized atheists, but Jews, he supported Zionism, but he said, what about the rights of what he called the natives? And he also said, maybe we ought to find a place that's more historically unencumbered, was the way he put it, than Palestine, which obviously had so much significance in so many ways. But Pinsker, law student, he was from Odessa. He started a group called the Lovers of Zion. And there was a conference that eventually led to what most people call the first Zionist settlement, even though the word did not exist for another 8 years. But the first settlement trying to have a nation state in Palestine was in 1882. Now, there were already Jews living there, but they were a very small minority. At this point, even in, say, 1917, when the British had the Balfour Declaration, Jews were probably 10% of the population of what is now, we think of as was what became British Palestine. There was just, very small number. And the great majority that were there at that point weren't really Zionists. They were religious Jews who wanted to live in the Holy Land, but they were not aiming to create, this secular political nation state. So you can see why people called Herzl the Jewish Jules Verne. But eventually, as I said, Pinsker is one of these people who began to doubt that you could really create an Eretz Israel in modern times, a land of Israel, by the time he dies in 1991, because one, he knew how much there was division among the Jewish world about this, and two, it was clear by the 1890s that the Ottoman Empire, which obviously controlled all that area that could possibly be a Jewish state, the Ottoman Empire was clearly not in favor of this. You know, the Sultan at that time, who I might have a picture of him, we'll get back to this in a second, but well, oh, let's, okay, yes, this is the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II. He was not in favor of this law. Once he learned what the Zionist project was, he was generally opposed to it. But the Ottoman Empire often didn't have a great deal of control over certain parts of the empire, and so there were local Arab landlords who were selling land to some of these early Zionists. You know, and this whole question about, you know, is this a settler, you know, colonial society? Well, Jews certainly didn't invade that area at this time period. You know, they were simply buying land and settling there. And at the very start, some of the natives, as Freud would call them, who were, of course, Arabic speaking, mainly Muslims, but some Christians. At first, they weren't too worried because sometimes the Zionists were bringing skills with them and energy. But once they started figuring out that what these people wanted to do was to create a Jewish homeland, which seemed to mean a nation state there, then you started having opposition among the, you know, the Arab population there. But let me go back to Herzl here. He was born in Pest, which is half of what's now Budapest in Hungary. So he was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His name is on there. Yeah, he was born in 1860, so it actually was still called Austria at that point. But when he was 7, it became Austria-Hungary. He was, like I said, not an observant practicing Jew after his childhood. He was an assimilated, you know, he loved the German language. He loved Wagner, which is kind of ironic considering the other big, you know, champion of Wagner is Hitler, not the only champion. But he began to change his mind. He was a journalist. And I think the combination of maybe 3 things. One, the rise of this kind of nationalism all over Europe that made him think maybe we need to do this. But also, some of you probably know the story of how this man, this is Alfred Dreyfus, Captain Dreyfus, about the scandal in France in the 1890s. And Herzl was there covering it for this Austrian newspaper, where a French officer who was Jewish, about the only French officer who was Jewish, was accused of giving military secrets to the Germans. And this is during peacetime, but you know, it's kind of like a Cold War between France and Germany. And he was found guilty pretty quickly, sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, which is off the coast of Guyana. But it started becoming clear that he was innocent because one, the secrets kept leaking out, and he's stuck on Devil's Island. You know, they were hoping he would die. It was based on this flimsy sort of evidence, handwriting evidence, and so on. But fortunately for Dreyfus, who always maintained his innocence, that his friends and family kept this case alive. And in some ways, it became a cause célèbre for the left wing in France, too. The right wing tended to support the army on this, and they tended to also often say, you know, Jews aren't real Frenchmen, and Jews were a tiny minority in France. But when Dreyfus was sentenced, and when he was sent off to this island, he had this public humiliation ceremony where they ripped that bless off his shoulders, you know, and his medals, and broke his sword in front of him. And Herzl was there, and he heard people yelling, you know, death to Dreyfus, but they also were yelling death to the Jews. And Herzl at least later claimed, this is when he saw the scales fell from his eyes, that if even in what he called the capital of the Enlightenment in Paris, even in Western Europe, in a country that, you know, had become a republic, if there's a strong anti-Semitism there, I wouldn't even call it an undercurrent because it was pretty open, then maybe we're never going to be accepted. You know, then maybe it's just an illusion to think that people ever really think of us as being truly French or German or Italian or Russian. So maybe we need to really have our own country. And also, some people would say maybe even more importantly, eventually, by the way, Dreyfus was clear. They had another trial. The army found him guilty again, but the president pardoned him. But eventually, his name was cleared, and he went back into the army. But this kind of anti-Semitism, there were lots of journals in France at the time that had these, you know, these horrible anti-Semitic stereotypes and so on. And so, you know, you have to sort of keep that in mind when you're thinking, how did Zionism ever get off the ground? And this is Karl Lueger, who was the mayor of Vienna in the early 1900s. He was very popular. He was a populist, but he was also anti-Semitic, at least politically he was. This is the man that Adolf Hitler claimed inspired Hitler to become anti-Semitic. Some people question that, but as a young man living basically as a bum in Vienna in the years before World War One, the young Hitler, started listening to this guy's speeches and began to say, yes, the Jews are behind all the evil in the world. Um, these are victims from a pogrom, and I think I have the word spelled there, yeah, underneath Nathan Birnbaum, underneath George Burns. Um, you can pronounce it pogrom or pogrom, but it's a Russian word that means devastation. And it now can mean any sort of anti-ethnic riot of any sort, but originally it was anti-Jewish. And you start having them, particularly starting in 1881 when the Russian Tsar was assassinated, not by a Jew or even group of Jews, but people blamed the Jews for radicalism. And there was a horrible pogrom in Kiev in 1881. And then they kept getting worse and worse in the 1890s, early 1900s. And again, I have to make a movie reference or musical, but how many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? Either a stage version, or the movie, right? Um, there's a pogrom right in the middle of that play, as you know, that musical, when the first daughter is getting married, and then suddenly there's rioting going on. And pogroms were about particularly, vandalism and wrecking people's homes and burning synagogues, but sometimes, people were murdered as part of it. And the thing about the pogroms is the government did very little to stop them, for a long time. They would eventually, sort of just like you see in the musical, the police and the army would finally kind of restore order. There are people who believe the Russian government actually secretly instigated these pogroms, which might be true. But in any case, if you were a Jew living in the Russian Empire, which is where the heart of the Jewish world was in the the 19th century, then you start thinking, I've got to leave. And by the 1890s, this is when you start having the first main wave of immigration to the United States. And far more Jews left the Russian Empire going to the United States and Argentina and Canada, then went to Palestine. But a very small number of them did start trickling down there as well. But the main thing is, it did make someone like Herzl. This is my most famous picture of him. This is in Basel in Switzerland with the first Zionist Congress in 1897. But Herzl writes this fundamental text that's on your list. Der Judenstaat wrote in German, which was his language, the Jewish state in 1896. And although the word Zionism, like I said, had already been coined, there were certainly all types of Zionism, really. But that book is the book that's thought of as the text for the creation of Israel. But he said he wanted it to be very open and public and legally guaranteed by the great powers, he said, because of course at this time in the 1890s, it was kind of the peak of European imperialism. And he was hoping that somehow the Ottoman Empire and the European powers would all agree that Jews need to have a homeland and that could be in Palestine. And he basically sort of, conveniently just kind of ignored the fact that there were people there, which is what cultures have always done, just like white settlers coming to North America. But he organizes the World Zionist Organization, starts it. They have their first sort of convention in 1897. I see I had the Dreyfus Affair on there. And this is a picture I was going to show about the fact that observant Jews were often very opposed to all this. These are modern day Orthodox Jews. Obviously, authentic Judaism was always opposed to Zionism. Mhm. Good. That's what I want. Right. Which is, this is the flag that they started to design based on the Jewish prayer shawl, which again makes it look like this is a religious movement because, the prayer shawl for men had those blue boundaries. And of course, that's the Mogan David, which everyone calls the Star of David, but it actually means the Shield of David. But there's a World Zionist Organization. But yes, what finally makes Zionism succeed is going to be the British Empire making a statement that we, the British Empire, feel that there should be a homeland for Jews in Palestine. And fortunately for the Zionist movement, when Britain did that in the midst of World War I, soon afterwards, Britain took control of Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. And that's what, this guy, and by then, Herzl died in 1904. I mean, he died at 44, but he said it will happen. even though people call him the Jewish Jules Verne, but this is a famous quote from him, "If you will it, it is no dream." And he said, within 5 years, he said, or at least within 50 years, everyone will see. And of course, 1948 was 44 years after his death. Um, but the story of how Britain makes this declaration and then almost immediately starts backing away from it. And also the story of the Arabs, because you were wondering, I'm presenting this so far really through the eyes of Jews and Zionists and so on. But there was, of course, the other side of the story of the creation of Israel to Arabs in that part of the world is called the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. To a lot of Jews, of course, it was this wonderful thing. When you immigrate to Israel, the term in Hebrew is the Aliyah, and that literally means the ascent, the rising. And it's the idea that we will rise to being fully dignified human beings by having our own country. But from the Arab-Palestinian perspective, it's the Nakba, it's the disaster. But I do thanks you for telling me, because I do want to hear possible questions or, like I said, objections or contributions, because I've just been talking relentlessly here. So, okay, way back there.
Talking to it. Can you hear me? Okay. It may be an apocryphal story, but I heard somewhere in my childhood that the pogroms were the reason that only children who were born of Jewish mothers were born Jewish.
The question was, were the pogroms the reason, the Jewish tradition, that you're considered Jewish only if your mother through the matrilineal line? I think it's older than that, but I'm going to look that up and make sure, because, I know it's established certainly by the 20th century, but I think it goes further back than that. But that's obviously a really important point, because, this whole question of what is a Jew and what isn't a Jew, the Nazis decided that if you had one, I think, great grandparent who was Jewish, if like you're 1/8, then you were a Jew. But that just begs the question, okay, what makes that 1 out of 8 people Jewish? It's just, it's also very important in Israel. They have the law of return. They passed in 1950, just 2 years after the creation, that said that if you were Jewish, you're going to be let in. They were going to have almost no other restrictions if we decide you were in fact a Jew. But then they ended up having to sort of turn that question over to the Orthodox rabbis, the minority in Israel back then, certainly, partly to sort of placate that community. And so there's some controversy about that, about some people who can't be decided to be Jewish, but there are certainly people who began to leave the Soviet Union in the 1980s and even 70s as part of letting the Jewish people leave, who arrived in Palestine or in Israel, Palestine, wearing like Orthodox crosses. And a lot of Jews say, "Wait a minute, Israelis." It's a lot of they're the Falasha, the black Jews from Ethiopia, who are almost all now living in Israel. They were airlifted out in the mid 80s when there was so much fighting in Ethiopia. And they serve in the Israeli army and so on. But there was some question about, are they truly Jewish? And of course they said, yes, we are. And, but I'm going to look into that. So, because I can't give you a definitive answer. But another question. Okay.
Was there some reason why most of the Jews were in the Russian Empire?
Question is, why were most Jews in the world living inside the Russian Empire? It's a really good question. In the Middle Ages, particularly in the 13th century, most Jews lived in what's now Germany, basically sort of Central Europe, and some were in England and France. But they began to be horribly persecuted. They were completely expelled from England and France at the end of the 1200s. And then all the different German states, they began to be persecuted, partly as part of the Crusades, kind of whipped up anti-Jewish feeling. So they moved east because the rulers there was this large thing called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that tended to have a tradition of being more tolerant. And a lot of the Polish nobility were willing to let these Jews in. And so to their credit, so like I said, it wasn't so much in what we think of as Russia, but more a little bit to the west of it, what's now Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and more Jews settled there. And of course, you always had Jews living in North Africa and Yemen and what's now Iraq and so on. But the heart of the Jewish world was there, and they spoke Yiddish, which is a form of German. It's like Low German, because they had originally been more farther west in the German-speaking region. So they were living among Slavic speakers, mainly Poles and Ukrainians and Russians, but they spoke this type of German, that was one of the languages considered to be maybe the language we'll make as the language of Israel. But a whole lot of Jews said, a lot of us have never spoken Yiddish, and it's not a uniquely Jewish language. It's a form of German. Herzl couldn't speak Yiddish either, though. He just spoke German. Didn't know Hebrew, certainly. But it's a really good question. Now, that population, of course, are all virtually gone now. The Nazis murdered them all. 90% of the Polish Jewish population was killed in the Holocaust, and that was the largest number of Jews, well over 2 million. So I'm glad you asked that, but I guess I need to let you. Okay, one more. Go ahead.
Itzhak Perlman is Jewish or from Palestine, but born in Tel Aviv. But his family is Polish, and they came to mandatory Palestine. Could you explain mandatory Palestine?
She's asking about Itzhak Perlman, one of the greatest violinists who ever lived, who, by the way, has some recordings of klezmer music, that is wild sounding. But you're saying, what is mandatory Palestine? That is what I'm going to start with next Sunday, but I'll go ahead and say, no, but that's okay. That's a very important question. When the Ottoman Empire, after World War I, they were one of the losing countries. And so the League of Nations divided up a big hunk of the Ottoman Empire and then mandated it, entrusted it to various winning countries like Britain and France particularly. And so the area that includes what's now, both the Gaza Strip and West Bank and Israel, all that area was mandated to Britain. And including what's now the Kingdom of Jordan, and was called, mandatory Palestine. Almost immediately, the British split it in half and gave the eastern half to the Hashemite family, this Arab family that had fought against the Turks, and they create the Emirate of Transjordan, to the east of the Jordan River. And so what became known as mandatory Palestine was only the part, it was a smaller part that was to the west of the Jordan River, and that's the part that became known as mandatory Palestine, and that's what it's called from like 1920 really till 1948. But that's what that's about, yes. Okay.
It's a blessing to this community.
Well, thanks. Okay, well, the mandate.